But first tonight, our program is with Ben Barrington. We're excited to have him with us. He is a retired engineering teacher from Clinton High School and a former state historic officer with the Tennessee Historical Commission, and just recently won the Publication Excellence Award through the East Tennessee Historical Society, and that was just earlier this month. So, been a busy guy. He has documented many of Tennessee's historical buildings and overseen their restoration and actually done some of the restoration himself. And no surprise, of course, he lives in a historical home himself, and I think you have a photo of that. He'll show that to us as well. So his wife is here with him. She's right back here. Hello.
His better half.
Yeah, better. That's right. That's right. So anyway, welcome, Mr. Barrington, and he's going to get started.
Tonight my topic is going to be on, as you see here, if these walls could talk, and looking at discovering some of those hidden secrets or mysteries that have always been hidden in those historic homes to see if we can get them to tell us a story. And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Discovering those hidden secrets of Tennessee's oldest historic buildings, we first begin by applying a scientific method of what do we always do in the scientific method? We start doing what? Asking the questions, right? We have a list of questions that we start to ask. Some of those questions might be, how old is it? When was it built? What was the time period? Who were the builders? And oftentimes we might think that that builder might have been the owner, but maybe not necessarily the case. It might have been someone else. How was it made? What's it made of? What's its architectural style? What are some of those special building features that we notice? And then we begin to stand and as we gaze, admiring the work and ingenuity of the builders who built these historic structures on the Tennessee frontier, does the building have a story? And that invariably, and then invariably someone will always say, boy, if these walls could talk, what could they say? Have you ever heard that? Always. That's exactly what it is. We want to learn that story. What is the story about that house or that building? Today, when we visit a fascinating historic structure, we often find ourselves wondering what life was like for people who originally lived there. How did they do all that work by hand with no modern tools or equipment? We ask these questions because most of those construction techniques our forefathers used and their living conditions are foreign to us. Maybe not as perplexing as the Egyptians who built the pyramids of Giza or the Inca stonework at Machu Picchu was fabricated, but curious nonetheless. In any case, for those of us who are curious and interested in learning about historic buildings and building fabric, we find ourselves pondering intently on these issues. So let's start. Does this historic building, have a story? And if so, how do we go about finding out what that story is? Can we get the building to talk? Sometimes we can. Sounds a little spooky, doesn't it? And yes, it does. This story is going to deal with ghosts in historic houses. But we're going to deal with Casper a little bit later. Before we go further, we need a little background information. We need to look at the larger picture, and that picture deals with the beginnings of Tennessee history. Today it is accepted that one of the first buildings built to be a home by our European ancestors on lands that would become Tennessee was a small hunting refuge of logs built by the famous Daniel Boone, along with accompanying long hunters from Virginia, North Carolina. It is obvious, this little seemingly insignificant log structure built by Boone on the bank of a small creek that flows into the South Fork of the Holston River became the temporary home of the first permanent white settler in what was to become the state of Tennessee. His name was, you know who he was? William Bean. Heard of that? William Bean, Captain William Bean. After the English Crown signed the Treaty of Hard Labor with the Cherokees on October the 17th, 1768, William, along with his family, moved from the Dan River area of southeast Virginia to this little hunting cabin on what is now called Boone's Creek. It is here that his wife Lydia gave birth to their last son. And in this image, we see a DAR marker that's situated right at the mouth of Boone Creek and the Watauga River in the first Watauga settlement. You've heard of the Watauga Association, the very first settlement that was established onto the lands that would become Tennessee. It was originally Cherokee land, and then when the Crown bought that land, the settlers began to move in Unfortunately, the settlers moved a little too further south. They moved across unknowingly, moved into the area that was still Cherokee-owned property. But in any case, this marker was set there by the DAR in about 1924, 1925, right on the spot where the hunting cabin and probably William Bean's first cabin was built. And this is the image, this is one of the images that historians now feel like was William Bean's first cabin that was built. You can see it's a log building with a nice log chimney. He brought his family here with his wife. He already had about 6 or 7 sons, and they were married, and so the house had to be fairly large for them to begin to set up housekeeping. Of course, very soon the sons started building their own houses, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. For years, explorers, traders, and hunters had traversed these Indian lands and beyond, but none had established a settlement before the Bean family. However, very quickly, and one could say simultaneously, other settlers followed the Beans into the fertile lands of Tennessee Valley and began clearing and planting fields and constructing shelters. As I said earlier, some even pushed beyond that treaty of 1768. Even though this presentation is not about the politics of the time, these events do have a bearing on the pioneer's desire for a type of dwelling that could afford his family as much protection as possible from problems arising from human conflict as well as those dished out by Mother Nature. It is safe to say that most of the earliest structures built on the Tennessee frontier were of the log type. It is here that we need to consider one of those perpetual questions: how did they do that? How did they construct such a substantial building by hand? And I love this next image. Was it just sheer pugnacious grit, as we see this young lady with her work on the fording the river here? So today we have a very romantic mental image of a self-reliant man or woman taking axe in hand, marching off into the wilderness and single-handedly chopping down an average of 50 one-ton large green trees to build a 1.5-story log cabin. Then after a hearty lunch, that would-be Paul Bunyan shouldered his special hewing axes and gauging tools and hew the logs flat on 2 sides, carry them 2 by 2 to the building site, carve in the desired corner notches, and stack the logs up the 4 walls, 1 by 1, to a vertical height of at least 20 feet. And the second day, I think you may be beginning to question the reality of my story here. What we need to realize is that by the time the pioneering Beans and others moved into the Tennessee frontier, craft guilds in the British colonies, which North America was one, had well been established. Specialized tradesmen were the frontiersmen. We can say with almost undisputed certainty that all of these settlers were to appoint farmers for sustenance, but skilled tradesmen for their livelihood. Jonesboro, the first town that was established in the Tennessee Territory in 1777. Am I going the wrong way? Here we go. Very quickly boasted available services such as store-bought goods. This is 1777. Okay. Store-bought goods shipped in along the Great Wagon Road from as far away as Baltimore and Philadelphia. Early patrons to Jonesboro's businesses could trade for feathers or flour, silk or salt, iron or iron pots, gloves or guns, wheat or meat, or hire special tradesmen to make carts and carriages, boots and hats, and even furniture, governmental and domestic housing. Historic documents show proof of these guilds that were so beneficial to the survival of the pioneer settler. We have to realize, like the story of the lone, self-reliant house builder, he cannot accomplish such a feat by himself, especially if he were not trained in the craft of the house writer joiner. Not to say it couldn't totally be done. Here we go, come on. There we go, right there. Interesting house. Not quite what we would expect from a house writer joiner, but like to say, it could be done. But for the most part, what we will determine here early, because this is a early 20th century photograph of a lone man. He's got his axe over his shoulder, wife in the doorway. You can see that the lumber has been milled at a sawmill, And you can notice that the post where he has that are holding up the boards are actually cut right here in the foreground. So he cut the trees down right there with his axe small enough that he could handle that. Just an interesting photograph. So let's take a look at some of those 18th century homes that were built on the Tennessee frontier, not all of which were constructed entirely of logs, but the use of local timber and stone supplied by woodsmen and masons are still evident. All of these homes were built within the first 20 to 30 years of Tennessee's 18th century frontier. How many of you are familiar with this house? This is Carter Mansion in Elizabethton. This house was constructed by Colonel John and his son Landon Carter about 1778, right at the beginning of the American Revolution. This is considered to be the oldest frame house in Tennessee, of course, built in Elizabethton, Tennessee. The exterior of the houses in these cases, now think about, right here, we're at the precipice of the American Revolution. Our mindset and Hollywood has told us that the frontiers of Tennessee were basically barefoot, dirt floors, and just hovels to live in. Take a look at this. This is the interior of this home. This is one of the front parlors. All of this millwork, that was once thought this millwork was brought from Virginia by the Carter family. But once they started doing analysis of the woodwork, they found out it was local timber, milled locally there around the Elizabeth and Sycamore Shoals area. So these were very skilled carpenters and joiners that were building these homes at this early period on Tennessee frontier. Here are two more images that we see. Back of the parlor, you can see the mantels, the over-mantel painting, and then the staircase. This one on the right hasn't been completely restored in this image yet. But today, the house stands like this. This was one of the first houses that I was CERT projects officer for the state of Tennessee back in the 1979, 1980, when the state first acquired this property. This house was pretty good shape, but it still needed a lot of work. One of the interesting things about this house, and talking about the 250th anniversary in the American Revolution and Tennessee's part in the Revolution, how many of you are familiar with the Battle of Kings Mountain? Mary Patton. Ever heard of Mary Patton? Mary Patton provided the powder, the black powder, that was the Over Mountain men took to defeat Patrick Ferguson at the Battle of Kings Mountain. That powder, when they were rendezvousing at Sycamore Shoals, was stored in the basement of this house. The next image, I'm sure you will be familiar with this guy. This is one of John Severe's homes. Now, John Severe had several homes. We know that now the one that the state actually keeps up and protects is Marble Springs here outside of Knoxville. I guess not far from here, actually. But this is one of his first houses that was built along the Nolichucky River. What was Governor John Severe's nickname? Remember? Nolichucky Jack. Nolichucky Jack. And this was one of the homes that was built along the Nolichucky River. And actually, it was the DAR placed in the 1920s. They put a historic marker there, one of their markers, like we showed you with the other one, with the bean cabin, a little bit smaller with a brass plaque in it that denotes where this house actually stood. It actually was still standing up until probably the mid 20th century. The property was on the property of the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency. And when the Historic Preservation Act was enacted in the 1970s, early 1970s, the powers that be felt like it was too much of a trouble to keep up, and they let it be destroyed. And so, but we still have some pictures of it. The chimney stood for several years after that, when I was with the state government, and we actually did some restoration on the chimney at that time just to try to preserve it, but we couldn't fight the government, so we lost it. Fortunately, a couple of years ago, one of the descendants of John Sevier was actually able to get a historical marker placed at one of the houses, which was basically across the river. This one actually was on Highway 107, if you're familiar with that road that runs between Greenville through Chuckey, Tennessee, going up toward Irwin. That's where this one stood. But this house was a log house. We have the picture to describe it. To see it, actually, it's what we call a V-notch. The notching technique is a V-notch log house, very large, built between 1789 and 1790. Period documents describe this house as it being extremely large and spacious, and John Sevier welcomed many visitors at his home here. So this is very important and is documented in the Sevier papers. The next home is a log building. You can't tell it from this because it's covered in siding, but this was John Sevier's rival. How many of you are familiar with hearing about the lost state of Franklin? This is the site of the Battle of Franklin, where during a snowstorm, a freezing snowstorm in February of 1788, Sevier's faction and Tipton's faction actually had a battle here that lasted 2 days. Really didn't end in much other than Sevier's children. 2 of Sevier's boys were taken prisoner, but they were eventually released. And there was a couple of slight casualties, but not much to that. But the big thing, it ended the state of Franklin. Tipton wanted to remain with North Carolina, in the state of North Carolina, its mother state. Of course, John Sevier wanted that new state of Franklin, which did become the state of Tennessee. This next home is what's called the Henry Ernest Fort House. It is in Chuckey, in Greene County, built around 1779, 1780. It is a very large building over a stone foundation. V-notch, once again, the notching. We'll look at some of the notching techniques in a minute, but you can see these early buildings were once thought to be all in the V-notching type of category, and once thought that they were older than the half dovetail notching that we see most of the log houses are today. But I don't think that there's any real evidence to that fact that we've been able to prove it. I think it was more along the line of the nationality of the builders and the craftsmen that built it. They brought with them when they immigrated from Europe. One important thing that I would like for you to notice is that this house has windows, as all the others do. And once again, we're at the Revolutionary time period, beginnings of Tennessee, and houses have windows in them with what? Glass. Glass. One of the things that was coming down the wagon road in the 1780s was window glass. And in the store journals, we have panes of window glass, 8 by 10, 10 by 12 sizes, being brought down in crates and then being sold in the stores in the 1780s. So people are going into the stores and buying window glass to put into their homes.
So Ben, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Those center windows, are those actually doors?
They're doors.
So would they have had a porch out
Yeah,
there?
they had porches there. This is the way it stands today. Yep. Henry Ernest was born in Switzerland, and he moved to this location in 1777. He came into Pennsylvania from Switzerland, and then came down the wagon road into Virginia, went all the way into North Carolina, but by 1777, he's over here on the Nolichucky River in the Tennessee Territory. And he commissions this house to be built. He doesn't build it himself. We don't know the names of the joiners and the timbermen that built the frame of the log house part, but we do know the name of the mason that did all the masonry work. His name was John Maris. He was identified in documents at that 1777 period.
What would they have kept in the basement part? Their canned goods or their...
It could be living space. In this case, it's living space. Now, like the one in Carter Mansion, It could be, because it's large enough to be used for living space, but it was, of course, it was used for storage too, because they were storing gunpowder and obviously other things. It was nice and dry. Obviously, that's where you want to keep it, where it's out of the weather, but nice and dry. This unseemingly house that probably everybody would just bypass, and when you look at early Tennessee houses, this house unfortunately no longer is standing, but it has a very neat history component to it. And it's the home of Samuel Crawford. He was a veteran of Kings Mountain. This house was situated on Whites Creek Pike in Tennessee, in a place called Grassy Valley, there in North Knox County. Are you familiar with that? Okay. This is a very unusual house because it's diamond notched. Remember, I mentioned most of the log houses that were built on the Tennessee frontier either half dovetail or V-notch. This one is diamond notch. Very rare. We see very, very few of these even reference to them. The other reference that we have of this diamond notching technique on the corners where the logs are put together, is with the second Jonesboro courthouse that was built in the 1780s. There's a description of where they are hiring Charles Robertson, who's the major carpenter and house builder in Jonesboro. They're giving him the instructions of how they want the courthouse built. And there are two very neat components to that description. Not only does it give the size of the building that they want, the height of the floors to the ceiling, that is 2 floors, where the bailiff box is going to be, where the judge's bench is going to be sitting, and all of those things. How many windows are going to be there, the heights of the windows, how the windows are going to have glass in them and then be barred, those kinds of things. But it also says that they want the building to be cornered with diamond notches. Very interesting. The second component that I find, because I worked with historic buildings all my life, is the fact that how do you hew the buildings? Now, typically, most of you have probably seen people demonstrating hewing log buildings. They get a log out and they chop marks in it, and then they'll take a broad axe and cut it square, and then they'll put the log up into the wall, ready to be used. Well, it's very specific instructions. The logs are to be laid up and then to be hewn down, quote, logs put up and then hewn down. That's completely opposite of the way that we think of doing it today. But one of the things that we found out is when we go back and look at the interiors of the log walls, we see that they're always much smoother than the exterior walls. So what we're driving from that is that the logs were hewn on both sides, put up, and then a finish carpenter came in with a nice wide, what we call a goose wing axe, and started at the top and actually planed down those faces to make them very smooth and uniform inside. So it made a nice finished look on the interior of the building. Very interesting. But this is Samuel Crawford, veteran of Kings Mountain, at least by 1790. As I said, this is a 2-pen log building. There are other buildings in this picture that are logging. You see one back over to the left. But the most important part about this that I find is that this is related to Moses Crawford. Anybody ever heard of Moses Crawford? Moses Crawford is considered to be Tennessee's first cabinet maker, furniture maker, and housewright. Moses Crawford was actually brought up on charges as being a Tory during the American Revolution. He was tried, but they found out that it was a point of mistaken identity. It was a John Crawford that was actually the Tory and not Moses Crawford that was doing it. So he sort of escaped those fines and being put in prison during the American Revolution. One of the things about Moses Crawford being considered to be one of the first cabinet furniture makers, what kind of furniture did he make? That right there. And believe it or not, the previous picture of the log house, this is the piece of furniture that was made for that house. So that's the kind of mindset these pioneers, our Tennessee forefathers, were doing. Very fine furniture pieces, a high style of living, even though you're living in a log house on the Tennessee frontier. We're going to, this piece of furniture, of course, designed in the 18th century, designed and made in the 18th century by Moses Crawford. It's now on loan to Mesda in North Carolina, in the museum, Furniture Museum in Mesda. But it was built here in East Tennessee and was in the Crawford Log Building. We're going to revisit Moses Crawford in a little bit. Are you familiar with this building? Now, this is not log, but it is masonry. This is Ramsey House. It's built by Francis Alexander Ramsey. He was a clerk, one of the first clerks on the Jonesboro Court when Jonesboro Court was first established. Up in Jonesboro, Tennessee. Jonesboro is, of course, the very first recognized town in Tennessee. And so this was built by him. Now it was called Swan Pond, just outside of Knoxville, not far from the Shelbyville Pike, not Shelbyville, but the Strawberry Plains Pike, going out from Knoxville. One of the neat things about Ramsey is the fact that if you are a historian, you probably are familiar with one or two of our very first Tennessee historians. Know who that might have been? His son, J.G.M. Ramsey. He wrote the Annals of Tennessee and published in 1853. It's a tomb of work, and everybody refers to Ramsey's work on the history of Tennessee. This is Ramsey Place as it stands today, and here are some of the interior views of Ramsey House. This house, Ramsey did not build it. He actually hired a builder architect from Charleston by the name of Thomas Hope, also a furniture maker. Once again, bringing professionals in to do the kind of work that they needed and they wanted to have done. Of course, Thomas Hope didn't build this by himself. He had a crew, specialized crew, to come in to do the work of the masonry work, to quarry the stone. The stone for Ramsey House came within just a few hundred yards of the mansion because that area is known for what? Quarries, and what came out of the quarries? Marble. And these corners are made, and you see the white marble pieces all the way across the front of the building. This is not an East Tennessee house. However, it is one of the earliest, or now considered to be the earliest remaining brick structures in the state of Tennessee. This is the Bowen House, built in 1787. This house would have been built in the Cumberland settlement, which Gallatin would have included that. But this house was built 9 years before Tennessee becomes a state. And you can see that. One of the interesting things that if you look close, you can see that in this brick, you notice a pattern. You notice that? That pattern is called Flemish bond. And that was very popular for people to show off their house. And you'll notice on the left side over there, you don't see the Flemish bond pattern. You only see it on the front, because as visitors would approach the house, they wanted to show off that part. It was more expensive. It took more brick to do it that way. It took more expensive brick to make that pattern on the house, but they wanted to show that part off. The Bowen House was built for Captain William Bowen and his wife, Mary. Captain William Bowen was a Revolutionary War veteran. He also received this land grant for this property from the state of North Carolina. And the masons were actually brought from Lexington, Kentucky to dig, fire, and form the brick and lay the brick. This house, one other point about this house is if you're even interested in the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, on this site is the site of Mansker Station, which was a frontier fort station. And the fort is not sitting on exactly the site. It was moved because of a highway, but the site was reconstructed on this property on Mosswright Park, which is just adjacent. If we could look to the left over here, you would see the Frontier Fort, the palisade wall, and the blockhouses that were in the fort there that were reconstructed. When I started with the state of Tennessee, this is what the building looked like. This is one of my very first, said, Ben, you go take care of this. So fix that, yeah. Now, I didn't do this personally. We did have specialized masons and crews to do that, but I was responsible for overseeing the work and making sure the checks got paid. So
Ben, I have a question.
yeah.
So did they have to make more brick to make some repairs? And if they did, would they have had to make the brick right there on the site?
Okay. This is a big, I wasn't going to deal with this myth. You're going to make me deal with it, aren't you? Anytime we're around a brick building or a house that has a brick foundation, and we go through and we listen to the speech from the docents or the tour guides, they will always tell you what? The brick were made by who? By the slaves. And where did the brick come from? Probably locally, right under the house, right? Well, unfortunately, chemistry doesn't work that way. Brick making, which has been going on since biblical times, and known how to do that. How many of you are familiar with the Bible story of the Tower of Babel? Anybody remember that story? Do you remember the part about what this says? As they were building the Tower of Babel, they were making brick, but they were doing what with them? You know, we think that brick were made for straw and mud, right? That's how we made brick. That's what the three little pigs did, right? Well, in the story of the Tower of Babel, there's a line in there that says that the bricks were fired well. If you put straw and mud in a kiln, what's going to happen? The brick is going to just burst wide open. So you will lose every brick that you made if you have straw or any impurities in that brick. Now, the firing of the brick at the time, even from biblical times to this time when this house was built in the late 17th century, or late 18th century, there was a very exacting formula for making the brick. There were masonry and brick guilds that were established even in Philadelphia. Tightly guarded secrets for how the brick formula was to be made and how the bricks were to be made. It took very special clay, had to go to a very special clay bank, and then you had to know the formula for combining the clay with the sand in order to get the right consistency. Even in making what we call the clamp kilns were very exacting on how that was done. There were secrets for that. They didn't let that secret out. Only that skilled level and craft level knew the secrets for how to do that. Those were very specialized people to do that. And so the masons, as I said earlier, that were brought, those were part of the skilled trade guild that came in to make that brick. If slaves were involved, which they very well could have been, they were there for basic labor. They weren't there to actually be in control of the formulas to make the brick or to even lay the brick, because they would have been very specialized skill in doing that as well. So I'm sorry to burst people's bubble about that, but the scientific chemical formula for actually putting that together doesn't work to dig it out of the yard. You know? So anyway, so how do we date buildings? That's one of the big questions. How do we determine how old the building is? When was it built? In this question, we probably find the hardest resolved answer. There has long been a conflict between real documented evidence and the assigned dating of historic structures. In the past, researchers and history writers have relied heavily on family stories supplemented with selected legal documents to prove the dates of historic structures. Other means of dating soon became utilized. The technique of association meaning by examining the building's fabric, that is, the building material, the hardware, the architectural style, construction tools, and techniques, researchers could begin to assign dates by comparing those with other structures with known dates. If we look just at historic buildings today, we find ourselves more often as not perplexed about the construction date because we now know our ancestors started building homes in America over 400 years ago, and in Europe much longer. Even in the comparatively short time span of Tennessee's 250-year history, log and frame home construction were the prevailing building types, with many of the same ancient construction techniques and tools still employed by the builders throughout this time period. Unfortunately, very few of the earliest frame structures, I just mentioned one of the few, like the Carter Mansion, has survived. Masonry was very obviously used, but not nearly as prevalent as the log structures that we see here in East Tennessee. And we see the log structures a lot here in East Tennessee, but as I've traveled across the state, I see them all the way across to Memphis and over into Arkansas, even down into Georgia, into Mississippi, all the way to New Orleans. So there was still that availability of timber and that skill level to continue to build that type of housing. So log building was a prevalent type here. So how do we date them? As we look at this image here, we see a group of nails and a group of screws. And we've been able to look at these nail types, and I'm sure many of you have heard of rose head nails, right? Rose head nail is obviously a handmade nail, and which means that one person has to take a piece of metal and with fire and hammer and anvil and beat out that nail and then put a head on it, and then you've got a nail to drive into a piece of wood. How many do you have to make to build a house? To even build a cabinet? You know, that's a lot of work. Very time consuming. However, it did happen. But nail makers, that also became a guild. If you were a nail maker, you were assigned to a guild, and that was your trade. You made nails. And so, but that time period, as technology advanced, then we started seeing different kinds of nails become available to purchase to build your houses with. In Tennessee, by the late 18th century, we see probably almost all of this first row, 1 through 6 up there. And what you have is a total handmade rosehead nail, and then you see sort of a squared off head that looks a little different. And actually the metal, the shaft looks a little different. This is what's called a hand-headed cut nail. Now, how do we get a cut nail? Cut nail has to be made by a piece of machinery. So now we're beginning to look at an advancement in technology and using it. As a matter of fact, in Sullivan County, Tennessee, that's our beginning of our iron industry in the state of Tennessee, in the territory that become Tennessee within Sullivan County, called, I can say this like, I can't say the name properly. It's, without in front of me, starts with a P. But it was the name of an ironworks that was started by James King along the upper course of the Holston River. And in that beginning of that iron furnace, he started implementing nail-making machines. And so they started making nails around 1800. So we should have nails that are cut nails and combined with handmade nails in houses as early as 1800 in Tennessee. And guess what? We do have. As soon as those nails were available, they were used. Over here on the second side of the slide, we see screws. And you can see some assigned dates to the types of screws that were made. Screws were used. They've been around since Archimedes. Remember Archimedes from science class? Yep. So screws have been around since Archimedes. And so here we see different development in the development of the screws that help us to assign a date. When you take a screw out of a piece of hardware that's on a door or in the house somewhere, and you compare it to this type of hardware, then you can begin to see some comparative dates to align with those points of date to bring a house together with that. As I mentioned earlier, association dating, historic building preservationists will compare hardware of known dated buildings to the hardware of the subject building. handmade door hardware, and cabinet hinges, for example, such as strap hinges that we see here, strap hinge, and the HL hinges, door latches, locks, hand-wrought nails, screws can be used to establish date ranges. Other architectural features can also establish dates, such as employed styles of fenestrations by the builder. Fenestrations basically means, it's a fancy word that we use in architectural historian work, as the type of doors, windows, mantels, staircases, balustrades, molding trim, all the interior planed work that's put into the house. That's called the fenestration. So we look at the comparative styles of that. The molding planes that were used to do that. When were those molding planes prevalently used? And so once again, adding to the group of information to allow us to assign a date to a building. Another telling observation is how the auxiliary lumber was sawn at the mill. You got all this other mill. That even in a log house, you've got planking, you've got flooring, you've got window trim, you've got doors that have to be built. All of that extra material, lumber, had to be cut at a mill somewhere. What were the first mills? And in this image, we see three different types of saw marks that are left on the mill, on the timber, as the saw cuts through it. The pit saw, the mill sash saw, and the circle saw. We know that the circle saw, the one that is most often used today, was patented in the late 1700s in Europe, but it was not put in use in America until about 1850. And so we know that this circle saw, see the rounded marks that we see from the round blade? That's how we would tell, okay, if it's here, then we know that probably that building can date no earlier than 1850. We see the material in the building. Or that addition was put on, a change was put on, no later, no earlier than 1850. And so the center mark is basically a water-powered sash saw. It is a mill saw that's run by water power, just like you would run a grist mill, just like you talked about the miller's going to come talk about corn, same kind of mill. And he would use that, instead of having grinding stones, they've got a saw blade, and we're going to look at that in just a second. And then over here on the far right is the earliest kind of sawing that was actually predates medieval period time of processing lumber. And it's done with what we call a pit saw. Obviously the circle saw blade, this, you see the teeth on the round circle saw as it rotates around, is going to make that curved mark on the timber. This is the sash saw that would be run by the water mill, just like the grinding of the corn. And as the vertical blade moves up and down vertically, the timber passes through the saw blade, and consequently you get the marks that are strictly vertical, straight up and down on the material. This next image is this pit saw. The pit saw was operated by two men, one on the top and one on the bottom. The square timber hewn flat on the sides and then placed over a dug pit, or as in this case, cantilevered over a cantilevered frame. The boards would then be cut from the larger timber, leaving distinguishing marks left by the saw blade. This differs from the up and down because you can see, just like if you were to use a handsaw to cut through a piece of wood, you're very rarely going to hold it straight up and down. You're going to hold it maybe straight up and down. You're going to move it a little bit at an angle, and those marks transfer directly to the board to give you an impression that obviously at the date, if we're looking at this timber, that board was cut probably with a pit saw when we see those marks. So once again, adding to, how do we come up with a date? Dating of historic log buildings can be a difficult, very, very difficult here. Here in Tennessee, especially in the mountains of Appalachia, log construction, as mentioned earlier, was the predominant building technique. For all those practical purposes, continue on through the 20th century. So something else has to come up. About that one. Another technique which has recently been applied to the dating of Tennessee historic structures and timber frame or brace frame structures was developed through the discipline of geographical climate studies. Fortunately, but sometimes unfortunately, the dating often dispels the treasured, time-honored beliefs of a previously dated historic structure being much younger than originally thought. How does this work? As you see, the young man here is taking a core sample. He's taking a drill and he's drilling into the log up through to the center of the log. He's going from the bark side all the way in toward the center. So what he's doing, he's going to take out about a 3/8 of an inch core, and in that core, he can then look at the tree ring growth rings. Very easy to see on the right side over here as we take a cross section of a timber and we cut it, and you can see here as they've dated each of the rings as the tree grew. Now what we're looking at here is the spring and summer growth rings of the tree, the white rings and the dark rings. And the reason climatic studies came into play here was because when they were looking at climatic changes through time, the tree, cutting the tree down and looking at that is a direct mirror of what the climate change was actually doing. What was climate doing at those years in time? And so that's how they begin to integrate those two disciplines together to do that. It becomes a much more exacting time period. If the log on the log house still has its outer cambium layer, which is usually hidden within the joint of the tree, they can actually tell the month that that tree was cut. Not just the year, but the month that that tree was cut down. That's how exacting it can be. Now, what types of log buildings were here? Now, many of you have seen different kinds of log buildings, but there's basically just a few different types. Come on for me. This image shows what is called a pin construction, or a log, just as log single pin construction or a double pin construction. What a pin means is when the logs are made and put together and joined together at the corners, it creates a pin, either a square pin or a rectangular pin. And here we see the single pin and the floor plan, the double pin, the saddlebag, and the dog trot. And I know most of you always heard about the dog trot, right? Two pins that are put together with a dog trot. And how many names are there for that? Dog trot, turkey trot, breezeway. I mean, there's 100 names that they call this type of log building. But these were the typical ones. The next thing we need to look at, well, let's see. Oh, I've lost a slide. Sorry. Is the corner notching. And the corner notching of the building, let's see if I can find one here. Well, here we can see it in this one. We can see that this corner notching is of the half dovetail type. And the, as I mentioned earlier, probably the V-notch or the half dovetail are the most common of that type. Okay, well, here we go. Well, let's go back to this. I think I've gotten a little bit confused. Try to recover here. The small cabin that we see here in Cades Cove that probably some of you are familiar with, this is more the typical size of a single family log building that probably served generational use through its lifetime before the park took it over. Most of them are in this size, to maybe a little bit larger construction. But so they go from this size, from this typical size, which is relatively small, to this size. This house was built between 1825 and 1828. It is called the Wynwood Stagecoach Inn. It was placed and is built along the Avery Trace. And be familiar with the Avery Trace. How many of you travel I-40 to Middle Tennessee for any reason? Or you're pretty much following Avery Trace. Avery Trace was a trace that Andrew Jackson traveled back and forth between his home at the Hermitage to doing his work as a judge in Jonesboro and Knoxville. He went along the Avery Trace. And so this is one of the stagecoach inns that he would have stopped at along the way. But you can see the scale of being some relatively small log building all the way to something of this nature. Yes, ma'am.
Is that an addition where that difference in the wood is there to the right and above the door, or is that part of the restoration?
The infill right there above the stairs? Oh, yes. Yeah, that was an exposed chimney. They just closed it in. That was a chimney that you could see the stone from that end, and they just closed it in. Mm-hmm.
Is that open to the public?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep. It's outside of Gallatin, Tennessee. You're looking at a picture of a recent restoration. Back about 20 years ago, a tornado came through and actually took off the top of the building. And it took the logs down the valley, all through Castalian Springs. Mm-hmm. But this is after the restoration work.
When you're timing a building, when you're trying to determine when it might have been built, and you're looking at the logs and the rings, are numerous samples taken so that would account for any renovations that might have been in a newer date in the original structure? Because I know around here, I can use my mother's family home, which would have been about, maybe 170 years old. There were several renovations and additions, and actually the structure looked a little different, but then also looked kind of consolidated. And I just wonder if you would take multiple samples to account for that.
Yeah, you do. And even though it may appear like the log building has never been changed for any reason, they will take several samples from several different logs, and then they will do that comparing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so that they're looking for that. They're looking to see what if there were changes, or if they're all a consistent, all cut at the same time and used at the same time. So they're looking at that. One of the things that we run into is that even though we might find what was looking like a historic log building, as a matter of fact, case in point that Ms. Dennett knows about, and that's the Sam Keller log building that we able to locate and move into the Heritage Center at Townsend that will be reinterpreted as his gun shop. But part of it was his log building. Well, that log building, as we began to take it, it was taken down, we began to clean it up and get it ready to go back into the museum, we noticed all these marks, Roman numerals on all the logs. And it wasn't for being taken down recently. It had been moved before. And it had been in his since probably, he was using it probably by 1840. So it had been built before that. He moved it to that location in the 1840s and lived in it until his death in the 1880s. And so, there could have been all kinds of changes that happened in that log building from that time to time. So those are the kinds of things that we look at.
And I know in Gatlinburg, particularly around the Pittman Center area, a lot of buildings were moved down the creek and actually relocated over time.
Right. So the next thing we want to look at is the chinking and daubing, the infill that goes in between the logs. The chinking term refers to the material that goes in between the log joints. Here in America, we have very few logs that really sit on top of each other in the historic log building genre. In Europe, and especially Scandinavia, a lot of the log buildings, they sit right on top of each other. They're squared on all four sides, and they sit right on top of each other they do not have a joint between the logs. But here in America, we do have the joint. And the two types of chinking that we see, two types of material that we see, is either stone or wood. But notice it's all wedged in between the logs. The reason for the wedging is so that it does two purposes. It first adds the keying mechanism to allow the mortar to key in as you fill in the joint with the mortar mix. But it also adds as a structural component to hold the logs horizontally so they do not sag going across. And we see it both. You see it wedging here with the wooden wedges. You see it wedging with the stone wedges. One of the interesting things that we haven't fully fleshed out yet is why did we find the stone in all of the 18th century log houses? Why don't we see the wood in the 18th century log houses? After the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, they move away from the stone and go entirely to the wood chinking. There's one theory that during the 18th century, there was a major threat still at hand for the pioneers that were living in these homes. The Indians were not shooting with bows and arrows. They were shooting with the latest mechanized guns supplied to them by Great Britain. They had the latest technology and weaponry. Bullets would pierce this wood, chinking here, but it wouldn't pierce the stone. That's a theory. It's not proven yet, but it sure does make sense that you would want to afford as much protection for your family when the threat was still there. Analysis of original log buildings that are still retain its joint daubing, and that's the next thing we're going to look at, is another myth that we hear most often, and that is the daubing that goes in was just dug up from around the foundation, dirt, and shoved into the joint, and that's what worked. Okay? Well, once again, science has to step in, and we start analyzing the original daubing mix from the original buildings that still retained its original daubing. We don't find dirt, we don't find clay, we don't find different colors of things. What we find is a very exacting formula of lime and sand creating a mortar mix of high lime concentrated mix. It sometimes will have a binder in it, such as hair or some other kinds of organic material, but it's predominantly sand and lime, hydrated lime, that's been processed to do this work. Now, why lime? You might know the properties of lime. Well, it won't rot, but it will expel moisture. It will not absorb moisture. Dirt absorbs moisture and will keep it. Even modern concrete, Portland cement, will absorb moisture and keep it. It acts like a sponge. Lime draws the moisture away to its outer self. And so that's the reason why the lime is there. Yes, ma'am.
I think I want to know about what kind of hair they had. You said hair could be
Hair.
lighter? Or are we talking like an animal?
Pig hair. A lot of it's pig hair. Pork hair. The real coarse pork hair. Yeah. They're always killing pigs. They've always got plenty of it. And in this image you can see, actually this house that you see over here is one of the very few full dovetail notches I've ever seen. And this happens to be the Rogers Tavern in Rogersville, Tennessee. That's hopefully going to start being under construction. They just recently pulled the siding off of it, and they're starting to look at the restoration work. But when they did, I went and took pictures of it, and you can see still the original daubing that's in there. But it is a full dovetail notch. It's extremely rare here. And in this right-hand side over here, you can actually see I've made a little magnifying glass to focus on the lime that did not get perfectly mixed into the sand mix right there. But you can see the hydrated lime there.
So how did they process the lime to put it in there? Did they have to just crush the limestone rock?
Yeah, it has to be roasted. Once it's roasted, and then it's ground. And then you have like a millstone that instead of grinding horizontally, it rolls vertically around a trough, and they would put the roasted limestone in the trough, and as it rolled around, it would crush it into a powder.
And that's readily available here. That's one of the big things.
Yeah.
That's absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Especially in the Strawberry Plains area.
Yeah, you couldn't build with this, you couldn't build with stone, you couldn't build with any of these 18th century houses, had to have lime to build them. And so yeah, it was available. It was one of those first things that they had to do in order to build their buildings.
So did they do that on site, or do they do that someplace else and then they have to?
Wagoned it. Yeah, they hauled it.
What did they put it in? What, sacks of some kind? Or?
Well, there are references in the journals to different kinds of linen bags and different sizes of linen bags. And they would use country linen, woven country linen, to make bags out of, what we would call sacks. Now, there is some thought that they made a hemp bag that we used to call a croaker sack. How many of you remember that? Croaker sack? Why is it called a croaker sack? What do frogs do? When you went frog gigging, you'd put your frog in a croaker sack, and that was the burlap bag. But there's some thought that they made them out of hemp. Yep. The lime masonry is hard enough to be structural, but not so hard as to cause damage due to the natural movement or expansion of contraction of the adjacent material. These properties of lime masonry have been understood and used by the ancestral builders for over 3,000 years. Actually, even further than that, the Romans understood how to make lime. And then they're making their roads. The Roman roads, they understood that lime was a major component in holding those roads together.
So if I have big potholes in my driveway, if I crush some limestone, put it in there, would that help?
It might. Put some hog hair in with it. All right. So now I know you're wondering, when was I going to bring up the spooky ghost story part? Right? Every house has got to have a ghost in it. Well, I was just maybe pulling your leg just a little bit. So I will try to explain why cultural anthropologists and historic house restorationists go talking to or looking for ghosts in a historic home. So what are ghosts in historic houses, and what can they tell us about the story of the house? In historic architecture, these non-spiritual ghosts are the faint physical traces left behind when a building is altered, known as architectural ghosts. They serve as an unintentional texture of memory, revealing the past lives of a structure through subtle scars in its current form. So that's a ghost. These changes in some cases are very large, such as a remodeling or addition. However, some changes are much more subtle and harder to see, leaving only a shadow of a feature that was once present in the original construction, hence a ghost. Example, worn patterns in the floor that currently move directly into a now solid wall, where a wall or where an opening or a door once passed. Cutouts in exposed ceiling joists. Here we go. Cutouts in exposed ceiling joists that where once a wall divided a room is now missing. A small burn on a wall where a candle shelf once held a burning candle a little too close. Outline marks left on the door jambs where earlier pairs of door hinges once supported pre-remodeling replacement doors. Changes in coloration in the flooring suggest the location of floor cloths or rugs. Some are even more subtle upon very close examination where a bride immortalized her marriage by using her diamond to scratch her name and wedding date in a prominent pane of glass. I could go on and on, but I think you get the point. Even though these ghosts are not the spiritual kind, they can, in a way, talk. And if you know how to listen, the historic building walls can begin to tell its story. And so I will now try to begin to give you one of our stories, a more personal note. After living in a historic Tennessee log building for over 20 years, I'll try to tell you this story. The story as we know it today began prior to 1791 on a tract of land situated on the north side of the Holston River, just a few hundred yards out of the floodplain, where two well-traveled Indian trails crossed. A log home complex was constructed by an early pioneer. One trail wound east from the Appalachian Mountains across the French Broad River to Dandridge, and then on to the Holston River at Mitchell Bend. Fording the river, the trace then crossed a buffalo trail, now called the Indian Ridge Road. The trail then meandered on and crossed the Clinch and Powell rivers in the direction of the Cumberland Mountain Range, passing through the Gap, and finally into the land of Kentucky. It is at this location where the trace is crossed that an early pioneer by the name of Aquila Mitchell had two large log buildings constructed, and soon after, because of the chosen strategic location, set up a store and tavern. The Mitchell Tavern at Tampico operated from the late 1700s up until the 1860s, when the occupation of Union troops destroyed the estate. The camping Union Army took the fencing for firewood, stole or killed all the remaining livestock. The soldiers emptied the store coffers as well as the stored provisions and protected provisions that were left for the women and children. The source of this information and this document comes from 1868 to 1875, Aquila Mitchell's Union, Aquila Mitchell Jr.'s, the grandson or the son's, application for reimbursement. Even though Aquila Mitchell Jr. provided the officers signed Army vouchers, the federal government denied reimbursement, simply stating invalid. Descendants of the Mitchell family continued to live at the home place until the death of Miss Pearl Davis in 1975, and the building sat neglected and vacant until 1992. Late in 1986, while I was traveling the byways of Tennessee, I came across the remains of the log buildings totally covered in vines and trees. On closer inspection, I discovered what remained of the structures was definitely worthy of saving. After much search, I located the local owner and descendant and made my inquiry as to the possibility of purchasing the structure and the small plot of ground on which it stood. The owner was very gracious but denied being ready to sell the site or buildings. He did remark that he might at some point just sell the building but never the land. I understood but left my phone number and business card in his hands with the hope that if he does decide to sell, he might give me a call. Fast forward to 1992. The long-forgotten hope of that phone call ever coming rang. I was thrilled with the prospect of owning this historic log home, even though at the time I knew nothing of its past history. After purchasing the building, what do you suppose my first question was? How old is it? Who built it? Who lived there? What do you know about it? Tell me everything you know. Same kinds of questions. And then the story begins. Upon my purchase, I now can't remember totally all of my questions I must have asked about the building's history. The descendant handed me a small stack of papers containing the above photograph and the 1963 Jefferson County Press article written about the old Granger County log building. Written in the first line of the article, it says, "One of the oldest homes in Granger County." Also early in its history, the log building had served as the community as a station and tavern where travelers could buy needed supplies and, if needed, a room for the night. The article mentioned a round stone located in the chimney with the inscription chiseled in the center with the initials A.H., who the current occupant believed could have been a builder by the name of Amos Hammond. Also, the log home was built for the early pioneer by the name of Aquila Mitchell that I mentioned earlier. The article continued with the additional information taken from the family Bible of all the births and deaths of his children, with the statement of the oldest child, Saluth, being born in the home in March 1791. With this one stroke of luck, I had just discovered a tremendous amount of the building's story. The first owner was a man by the name of Aquila Mitchell, a tavern and storekeeper. The building had been completed by 1791 or earlier, and the possible builder was a man by the name of Amos Hammond. Since I was not able to purchase the house and the lot, the building had to be dismantled piece by piece and transported to its current location in Anderson County. Within a couple of years, funds were secured and the restoration and reconstruction began. Today, the log building stands reflecting the period of the houses as the house might have looked between the years 1800 and 1825 at the height of the store and tavern period. At this point, we need to revisit the story of Moses Crawford, the log building, and he is a cabinet maker. In the late 1700s in the northern part of Knox County, Moses Crawford, Tennessee's first furniture maker and carpenter. After extensive research, and this is where the genealogy sort of kicks in, much research into the archival documents, I was unable to locate an A. or Amos Hammond living or working in East Tennessee, much less Granger County. What I did find was a family of master housewrights living in a portion of Granger and Knox County by the name of Hall. Two such men with the name A. Hall, father and son. Looking back a few pages, we see that the death of Moses Crawford in 1819, Tennessee's first house builder, we find Andrew Hall purchasing all of Moses Crawford's carpenter tools. The Halls were contemporary craftsmen with Crawford in the upper East Tennessee Holston settlement. Andrew Hall, being a master housewright, would have had apprentices, and upon those apprentices reaching the age of 21, he would have been required to give them a full set of tools. Hence, he was buying tools for one of his apprentices. And guess what? His initial is A.H. And you can see the round stone there in the chimney. And here it is. You can barely see the AH right there for Andrew Hall. The next few slides are just some interior views of the building as it stands today. This is the way we live.
Yeah, this is your home.
Yes. Mhm.
And put your hand up, you help.
That's right.
Ladies, you don't know how you can work like a man.
But the log portion of the house had 6 fireplaces. 2 in the basement, 2 that you see here, and 2 on the bedroom levels upstairs. The house, each floor had 3 rooms per floor. On the main floor, we did not put it back as with the 3 rooms because you could see in the ceiling joist where that 3rd room was there. It had already been taken out, so we didn't reconstruct it in the house. And then the rest of the house that you saw in the first picture, it was very large. It had the addition onto the back, which is a brace frame, which was a kitchen and dining room that had 2 fireplaces in it. By the 1840s, being a tavern and inn, they increased the size of the building by 1840s and put another 2-story building on the front side of that we didn't reconstruct. At a point, it just gets too big. We didn't. So. And it was of the 1840 period, and we had set our cutoff point was 1825, so that's pretty much where we stayed with. And here again, you can see the HL hinges. The 18th century locks on the doors were still there. And this is the way it sits today on the farm.
What's the square footage of that, roughly?
We're up to a little over 7,000 feet.
7,000 square feet in that building?
Yeah,
How long did it take you to put it back together?
about a year.
But Ben never expresses this. We have 3 daughters, and Ben can do anything.
Teresa, okay, let me finish. I'm still not through yet. But, unfortunately for this old house, we've never seen a ghost. But if we know about ghost stories, if you ever hear people talk about ghost stories, they're usually more active during certain seasons of the year. So we actually have things that are worse, that are more active during certain seasons of the year. And that's these little rascals. And thank goodness it's now spring and they're gone. So do you have any other questions?
What's the benefit of one notch versus another notch, like the dovetail?
The dovetail or the half dovetail?
From the diamond notch?
The diamond notch. They're still binding. We think pretty much now that there's a preference of the nationality of the builder, what they learned to do in either the original 13 colonies that they came from, and those 13 colonies techniques came from Europe. Now, not so much from England, because most of the Jamestown settlements and the Philadelphia western or the eastern coastal buildings, we don't see a lot of log structures. We see timber frame or half frame structures. That's very typical English. But by the time we get to the interior, we've brought the Scotch-Irish, we've brought the Germans, we brought the people from Norway, Switzerland, and they are used to that log building type. When they got to America, what they weren't used to having was the amount of timber that was here. As a matter of fact, I've mentioned in one other presentation that whenever the colonists were set up here, why was the colony set up? Why did England set up colonies? Natural resources. And what was the thing that England didn't have? Lumber. They didn't have timber. And so that's the reason the colony was set up here, was to set up a colony, start negotiating with the Indians, the Native Americans, and then start cutting down trees and loading them back into into the hulls of ships as ballast and send them back to England. And in turn, that trade brought back finished goods. And that was the whole thing. So your fee for being here was to send back lumber, but when you got the finished good back, you had to pay for it. And then eventually, you had to tax it if you sent it out, and then you had to tax it if it got taxed if it came back. So consequently, 1776 becomes very evident as to why it happened. You know, it's all about the money.
Anybody got any more questions? Well, thank you.
Well, you're welcome.
Mr. Barrington.
Thank you.